One of my favorite sermons that I only remember a snatch of was by a guy named Mike Bro. And here was the bottom line on his sermon was the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And I've plagiarized that and preached that message every time I can bring that. People resonate with it. And here's why. Because if we're not careful, a lot of things that are not the main thing can become the main thing, right? Life, if we're not careful, life can become, our focus in life can get on the peripheral, and we miss the point. We're doing things, and often these are good things, but they're not the main thing. And when that happens, well, there are a series of things that will, dominoes that will fall. When that happens in an individual's life, they're going to the trajectory of their life will go. It's going to go sideways. Think about this. I'm going to use a NASA and a golfing illustration. First, the golf illustration. If this happens to me all the time, the ideal is that when you strike the golf ball, the plane of the face of the club will be at a perpendicular angle to the line of your target. Okay? Now, if the face is off 1% at impact, you're going to be off 10, 20, 30 yards from your target line, which sometimes doesn't make any difference. Some fairways are wide, but when the fairway is narrow, it's the difference between a triple bogey and a mere bogey for a golfer like me. If you start out a little off, by the time the trajectory gets out there, you're a long way off. And that, with you launch a rocket, and we've had a couple of private citizens launch their rockets, gazillionaires who, I guess they figure, I've got more money than I'll ever spend. Why don't I spend it on doing something I think would be cute and fun? And I might even be able to convince people that I am making the world a better place. But whatever. Not my money, not my responsibility. Okay. But if the launch angle is, well, let's say 2 degrees off, and they're going 5,000 miles into space, 6,000 miles. By the time they get out there, they're going to be a long way off. And so little things at the beginning become big things at the end. That's why making the main thing will never not be important. And what has happened in Ephesus here in 1 Timothy 1, that Paul he doesn't even unpack it, but he leaves us with the sense that they've not made the main thing. And then remember we looked in the book of Revelation, chapter 2, where at the beginning of that chapter, a letter from Christ himself says, I know your works. And he goes on to list a substantial list of good things, positive things, noble and worthy things. And then he says, but I have this against you. You've lost your first love. As though somehow this first affection for, this first passion for, this first love for God and his design and his ways and him have gone by the wayside. How does that happen? It happens when we don't make the main thing the main thing. And so Paul writes, and again in verse 3, as I urged you when I went to Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer. That is a very blatant, when you teach false doctrines, you are not just, this accidental 1% or 1 degree off. When you teach a false doctrine, you are intentionally moving the trajectory. Or to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies. In other words, if you're going to devote yourself to something, what are you supposed to devote yourself to? Okay, a Sunday school answer here will do. Jesus. Yeah. Devote yourselves to, what does it mean to devote themselves to myths and endless? When you devote yourself to something, that means, well, as I'm recording this, we're in the midst of the Olympics. And even in empty stadiums, those every 4 years, and this time in the 5th year, there are athletes who, for their various disciplines, have devoted themselves to training and I suppose some of these athletes have devoted themselves to training so that they could participate in various events. But those are all the losers. There is an elite group of people who have trained themselves to win, and they have devoted themselves to their training. So what that means, if you devote yourself to something, you don't just say, well, I think I'd like to win this event. No. You train 6, 7, 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, some of them 7 days a week. You restrict your diet, you know what, you change you alter your lifestyle because of your devotion to that objective. Okay, these people have devoted themselves to the wrong things. If you devote yourself to Christ, to his design, if you devote yourself to God and reflecting his love, his nature as best you can, you won't have time for myths and endless genealogies. What is my paraphrase of this is Paul is saying they devoted themselves to stuff that isn't even fluff. It's not just tangential from the central theme of following Jesus. It's like they're wasting their lives on things that simply don't matter. And then he goes on to say, such things promote controversial speculations rather than advancing God's work. Well, yeah. I've observed a number of church splits. I have, in one of my ministries, I experienced the backwash, I would say, of a church split. Some church splits and divisions are the result of doctrinal issues, and others are purely a personality issue. But by the time, whatever the issue is, by the time it has gotten to the point of severance, it has become a a controversial speculation, and it promotes these controversial speculations are not about, all right, here is what exactly happened. Let's think about why that happened and what we're supposed to do about it. No, speculation doesn't have to do with evidence that we observe. It has to do with, well, what speculation? Speculation is my guess on the basis of what I see. Speculations are sometimes true and valid, but not always. I could even say, depending on who speculates, not very often. But Paul says that when you fail to make the main thing, well, the end of that is you will promote controversial speculations rather than advancing God's work. Now, here's what's the main thing: to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. That's not a formula, but that isn't a description. And if we can live our lives as followers of Jesus, observing that, and if we make that the main thing, if the main thing is love God, love people, and we keep the main thing, I'm convinced, and I don't think you'll ever be able to convince me otherwise, that will become attractive to people who don't know God, who don't know Jesus. They will observe our lives like the unbelievers and non-believers in the first century who said, wow, man, these people love. And it makes Jesus attractive when we do that. Okay, if we're not, that's how do you advance God's work? You don't do that by condemning. You don't do that by, I don't think you do that by a crusade of force. You do that through influence. And your influence and my influence is limited by our regard for the people we're trying to influence. A little principle here, it's actually a very big principle, but it's easy to say. At whatever point my interests in anything I'm promoting, whatever point my interests become more important than the other person's interests, it becomes a manipulation and not influence. How do we advance God's work? Through the influence of our lives as we follow and imitate Jesus. You don't do that when you get this, I'm going to call it again, tangential view of, well, there are just all kinds of ideas out there, and oh, by the way, there is a hierarchy of importance and prestige that has to be evaluated and followed and observed, and no. In fact, Paul says, such controversies promote controversial speculations rather than advancing God's work, which is by faith. This is important that Paul identifies the methodology and the energy behind our advancing God's work. It's by faith. And that's such a big subject. We've got to come back to it next time. And so we will on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.